Party peoples of the interwebs, virtually everything they once called a conspiracy theory,
they literally now just confirmed as reality.
Viva Fry, former Montreal litigator turned current Florida rumbler, in my home office, and I now have two former friends, WZ and MS. If you're watching this,
go suck a lemon, I told you so.
Alright, jokes aside, although that really wasn't a joke, I freaking told you so. There was recently a report published by the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic, a bipartisan committee that came to certain conclusions, all of which, or at the very least, virtually all of which, confirm that which was once called a conspiracy theory. The report is a whopping and daunting 500 plus pages. It's sort of the throw a bunch of crap at the wall and hope nobody notices, make it so bloody complicated, inaccessible, that hopefully people won't access it. I got an executive summary. I went through cherry picking certain sections just to confirm what I already knew, but you go through the introduction, you go through the executive summary, it literally outlines bullet by bullet that which was once called a conspiracy theory is now being confirmed reality. Congress of the United States House of Representatives Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. Dear colleague, it has been my distinct pleasure to lead the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic for the 118th Congress. I was honored to be entrusted with a great responsibility to investigate a once-in-a-100-year pandemic and to prepare America for next time. And there will be a next time. This is a responsibility I took very seriously, and I believe that seriousness and teamwork has translated to much success. Oh yes, they looked into the so-called coronavirus pandemic, and holy crab apples, when we get to the findings, it's gonna blow your freaking mind, in that it's not gonna blow your freaking mind, because anybody who's been paying attention is gonna say, yeah, I knew this from the very beginning. How are you now only catching up with this 4 years later? But first, who authored this subcommittee report? This whopping massive report, or at the very least, who headed this subcommittee? His name is Brad Wenstrup. Brad Robert Wenstrup, born June 17, 1958, is an American politician, U.S. Army Reserve officer, and doctor of pediatric medicine, who has been the U.S. representative for Ohio's 2nd Congressional District since 2013. A Republican, he upset incumbent U.S. Representative Gene Schmidt to win the 2012 Republican primary election. In November 2023, he announced he would not seek re-election in 2024. Why is it important to highlight his credentials? So that you naysaying idiots out there can't get away with telling yourselves, oh, he's not a doctor. Oh, he is a doctor. Oh, but he's not a virologist. Oh, too freaking bad. This guy's got more medical training than you, so take his conclusions seriously. In 1976, Wenstrup graduated from St. Xavier High School in Cincinnati. In 1980, he graduated Omicron Delta Kappa and cum laude with a BA in psychology from the University of Cincinnati, where he was a member of the Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity. He then attended the Skoll College of Pediatric Medicine of Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science, where he earned a BS in biology and a Doctor of Pediatric Medicine degree, graduating in 1985. Bottom line, he's got credentials. Bottom line, they've confirmed what a great many people were saying from the beginning, and if you had any doubts, I remind you now of the Great Barrington Declaration. And now back to the conclusions of this Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. 5 years ago, on December 1, 2019, was what would eventually be the first confirmed case of COVID-19. After that, a pandemic devastated the world at nearly never-before-seen proportions, leaving millions dead and millions more concerned about long-term consequences. COVID-19 was novel. The brightest scientists and medical experts were learning on the job to determine how to treat both the underlying disease and the second-order side effects. Since February 2023, the Select Subcommittee sought to produce a full after-action report to provide a roadmap of how we, in Congress, the executive, and the private sector may better prepare for and respond to future pandemics. Throughout this process, the Select Subcommittee sent more than 100 investigative letters, conducted 38 transcribed interviews or depositions, held 25 hearings or meetings, and reviewed more than 1 million pages of documents from dozens of custodians. This work looks back on many events, comments, guidances, and other actions to look forward. This is the single most thorough review of the pandemic conducted to date. For the purposes of this vlog, we're only going to go over the executive summary findings, which is going to be enough because I'm going to give you my commentary on a one-by-one basis. You can go read the entirety of the report if you so choose, or certain sections. The link is going to be somewhere in the description. But let's just get to the findings, all of which anyone who is paying attention is going to say,
yeah, this is nothing new.
It's nothing new, except it confirms the fact that, yes, it was the government that was the #1 purveyor of disinformation and misinformation out there, calling conspiracy theory that which they are now acknowledging as a matter of fact. Most of you know me. You know I strive to work collegially with our fellow Americans to provide results for all of us. This is the same mentality I brought to my work as chairman of the Select Subcommittee. During a time of intense partisanship, the Select Subcommittee had bipartisan consensus across multiple topics. Bipartisan consensus across multiple topics, many of which you're going to say, hey, they had bipartisan consensus about 3 years ago that this was all crazy conspiracy theory. They called people conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers, had them deplatformed, censored, suppressed, defamed for what they are now acknowledging was in fact true from the very beginning. But they didn't know from the very beginning, although a great many people did, so why they didn't is the question to be asked. But yeah, wait until we get into this top 10 of I freaking told you so. 1. The possibility that COVID-19 emerged because of a laboratory or research-related accident is not a conspiracy theory. Oh, really? So when The Lancet was saying it's a conspiracy theory, and when a New York Times journalist was saying it's a racist conspiracy theory at that to suggest that this originated from a Chinese lab in Wuhan, China, now it's not a conspiracy theory because it's basically been confirmed as a matter of fact? You're gonna notice a theme throughout this vlog.
Hashtag Nuremberg 2.0.
And don't worry, this Chinese connection comes up multiple times in this bipartisan consensus executive summary. Number 2, EcoHealth Alliance, Inc. and Dr. Peter Daszak should never again receive U.S. taxpayer dollars. Number 3, scientific messaging must be clear and concise, backed by evidentiary support, and come from trusted messengers, such as frontline doctors treating patients. In other words, it doesn't come from the Faucis of the world dictating to pharmacies what prescriptions they can and cannot fill, what medications frontline doctors can and cannot prescribe to their patients. In other words, it confirms what Trump was saying, that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin were totally legitimate drugs to be prescribing, but lo and behold, the order came from the top down and not from the practicing doctors bottom up. The bottom line conclusion, the independent practice of medicine was co-opted by the government that was issuing the directives, not the doctors themselves. More simply put, the censorship and the government action actually killed people. Do not ever forget that.
Nuremberg 2.0.
Number 4, public health officials must work to regain America's trust. Americans want to be educated, not indoctrinated. Translation, the government was issuing propaganda to coerce Americans by hook and by crook into certain actions that was actually not supported by the science. That's what they're saying in more polite terms. Nuremberg 2.0, but let's go to item number 5, and the survey says, former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo participated in medical malpractice and publicly covered up the total number of nursing home fatalities in New York. Translation, Cuomo killed people when he implemented the policy of nursing homes being required to take back in COVID-19 positive patients after having immunized the executives of the nursing homes. In other words, Cuomo killed people and then covered up the fact that he killed people. And you know what the biggest problem is? He's not alone. Gretchen Whitmer, you should be on that list. I suspect you're not, because you might be one of the Democrats' 2028 political candidates. In addition to these notable bipartisan successes, the Select Subcommittee developed extensive findings, some of which include: 1. The U.S. National Institutes of Health funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Translation, Fauci lied to Congress. Fauci lied, people died. Translation, it was true from the beginning, but they denied it from the beginning. Nuremberg 2.0, but it doesn't stop there. Let's go back to China. 2. The Chinese government, agencies within the U.S. government, and some members of the international scientific community sought to cover up facts concerning the origins of the pandemic. Holy sweet merciful hell, does everybody understand what is being admitted to here? On a bipartisan basis, the Chinese government participated in covering up the origins of the virus, which originated in a lab in Wuhan, China, or at the very least, it's no longer a conspiracy theory to assert that, and members of government agencies in America did so as well, and members of the international community who we still rely on for guidance. This is absolutely outrageous, and I hope people understand that. It's one thing to say, I told you so, and it's one thing to say this is exactly what the people who knew better were saying from the very beginning, but they are actually admitting criminality, in my humble opinion. But it gets even better as relates to Operation Warp Speed, because I've said this multiple times. If Trump has one blind spot, it's that he wants to claim that Operation Warp Speed was a whopping success, when I humbly disagree. But wait until you hear what they admit in the context of praising Operation Warp Speed. 3. Operation Warp Speed was a tremendous success and a model to build upon in the future. The vaccines, which are now probably better characterized as therapeutics, undoubtedly saved millions of lives by diminishing likelihood of severe disease and death. Mother effer, I am trying not to swear, but I'm old enough to remember when people who suggested that the so-called vaccine was in fact at best a therapeutic were called anti-vaxxers. I remember that because I was part of that debate. I was part of that public outcry, and when Dr. Kieran Moore out of Ontario finally admitted by slip of the tongue that it's a, quote, therapeutic, I jumped on that and put that on blast, and we were still called anti-vaxxers for trying to force the world to acknowledge what they are now admitting, that that jab was at best a therapeutic, and according to many, tiny, a therapeutic that does a good job reducing your lifespan.
I just recommend it to everybody instead of saying it's a personal decision.
Because at present we're doing a risk-based approach.
What's the risk?
The risk, there's always a risk to having any therapeutic, to having any therapeutic versus a benefit. You want to make sure there's a very strong benefit versus the risk. If for an 18-year-old healthy individual, the risk to getting hospitalized if we have no medical illness is very, very low. We know there is a risk, a very small risk, 1 in 5,000 that may get myocarditis, for example, and you'd have to have that discussion on the risk-benefit of a complication from the vaccine versus a benefit of decreased hospitalization.
But yeah, whatever. Operation Warp Speed saved millions of lives, and I'm sure the data backs that, but who cares? It was a therapeutic, people, and the people who called it a therapeutic at the time were called crazy right-wing conspiracy theorist anti-vaxxers. And then we get into the economic fraud of all of this, which was just as rampant in Canada as it seems to have been in America. 4. Rampant fraud, waste, and abuse plagued the COVID-19 pandemic response. All right, so a bunch of us out there can say, I told you so. We all knew that there was massive fraud being perpetrated in terms of getting these subsidies, in terms of getting these loans, whatever. Money is just money. It's not loss of life or injury. Let's get back to the irreparable harm that was caused to society as a result of these wholly unscientific and purely tyrannical COVID measures. 5. Pandemic-era school closures will have enduring impact on generations of America's children, and these closures were enabled by groups meant to serve those children. Oh, so you're finally acknowledging that the lockdowns, school closures caused irreparable harm to America's children, caused by people who were supposed to be taking care of those children. But don't worry, it didn't affect Bill Gates' kids because he was sending his kids to private school.
It's pretty clear because young people don't get sick from the disease very often, that we probably, if we knew everything we know today, we would have shut schools down a lot less than we did during this pandemic. You know, for college, going virtual tends to work awfully well. The infection levels are a little higher as you get up into that age group. But K through 12, we have a learning deficit that will take us a long time to erase that. And sadly, it's a deficit where the inner city is where it's almost 2 years. Suburban schools less, private schools in some cases, like my kids, almost no deficit at all.
You caused irreparable harm to a generation of American children, and this irreparable harm was caused by the people who were entrusted to protect those children, and you did it under the guise of protecting those children. Nuremberg 2.0, nothing less will satisfy. And it's not like anybody was saying that school closures, lockdowns would do more harm than good. You know, it's not like this little thing called the Great Barrington Declaration existed in 2020. The Great Barrington Declaration is an open letter published in October 2020 in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns. It claimed harmful COVID-19 lockdowns could be avoided via the fringe notion of, quote, focused protection, end quote, by which those most at risk of dying from an infection could purportedly be kept safe while society otherwise took no steps to prevent infection. The envisaged result was herd immunity within 3 months as SARS-CoV-2 swept through the population. Well, Wikipedia, you propagandists, you're probably going to want to go and update that article on the Great Barrington Declaration and describe it in less slanderous terms because, surprise, surprise, they were right. And setting aside the fact that medical experts predicted that these measures would cause more harm than good, there were other constitutionalists out there, other lawyers saying, yeah, you know what else doesn't allow for this? The freaking Constitution itself. Not to pat myself on the back, but Robert Barnes and I have been saying this for about 4 years now, that the Constitution does not contain a virus exception. And lo and behold, 4 years later, there is now bipartisan consensus that the Constitution does not contain a virus exception. Item 6, the Constitution cannot be suspended in times of crisis, and restrictions on freedoms sow distrust in public health. And finally, the prescription cannot be worse than the disease, such as strict and overly broad lockdowns that led to predictable anguish and avoidable consequences. Predictable anguish and avoidable consequences. You know what that sounds like? Criminality for which people need to be locked up. Nuremberg 2.0. Predictable and avoidable means you don't get to say, who could have foreseen this, except for the signatories to the Great Barrington Declaration. Predictable and avoidable means you don't get to wash your hands and say, we didn't know, because you did know or you should have known, and if you didn't know and you should have known, you deserve to be in jail. So yeah, just some minor news breaking that the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic came out and in those 11 bullets, I think it is in total, confirmed everything that some of us already knew, confirmed that the government engaged in propaganda, in censorship, adopted measures that did more harm than good, and that were totally unscientific and that damaged a generation of American children. What do you do after that?
Nuremberg 2.0.
Actually, before Nuremberg 2.0, you know what you do? You go right down there, you make sure that you are subscribed, that you have notifications turned on. But jokes aside, take 3 seconds to do it. My goodness, this confirms what many of us have been saying for a long time. It's vindication, but vindication after the harm is done, which is very little vindication at all. But the bottom line, the government should not just be ashamed of themselves, they should be held to account. The media should not just be ashamed of themselves, they should be held to account. All social media that's censored should not just be ashamed of themselves, they should be held to account, because all of those measures contributed to people dying who did not need to die, to a generation of children that will be damaged as a result of this, and somebody at some point needs to be held to account. We can start with Anthony Fauci, who lied under oath about the origins of the virus and the funding of gain-of-function research. Go to jail, Fauci. That is it. Hashtag Nuremberg 2.0, hashtag Fauci for prison, hashtag Bourla for prison, hashtag Bonk Hell for prison. That's a good start to making amends with the people who have been victimized and brutalized by these totally unscientific and tyrannical measures. All right, and with that said, if you like what I do, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe. Most importantly, exercise, eat healthy, sunlight, talk to people in real life, and now you know you vlog. Peace out, peeps. Booyah!
Viruses that in nature only infect animals were manipulated in the Wuhan lab to gain the function of infecting humans. This research fits the definition of the research that the NIH said was subject to the pause in 2014 to 2017, a pause in funding on gain of function. But the NIH failed to recognize this, defines it away, and it never came under any scrutiny. Dr. Richard E. Bright, a molecular biologist from Rutgers, described this research in Wuhan as the Wuhan lab used NIH funding to construct novel chimeric SARS-related coronaviruses able to infect human cells and laboratory animals. This is high-risk research that creates new potential pandemic pathogens that exist only in the lab, not in nature. This research matches, these are Dr. E. Bright's words, this research matches, indeed epitomizes, the definition of gain-of-function research done entirely in Wuhan, for which there was supposed to be a federal pause. Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement. This paper that you are referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function.
So
let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans.
Right.
You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly. And I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about.